Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Rick Walsh had built his life on 3 principles: loyalty, family, and never showing weakness. At 42, he owned a successful private security firm that contracted with high-profile clients across the state. His military background in special forces had taught him that survival meant staying 3 steps ahead of everyone else, and that lesson had served him well in both business and marriage. Or so he thought. The Walsh family lived in an upscale neighborhood in Pine Ridge, where Rick's reputation as a man you didn't cross was well established. His wife Delia, 38, had been the perfect partner for 15 years, or at least that's what Rick believed. She was charming at dinner parties, supportive of his business ventures, and had given him Sarah, the light of his life. Sarah Walsh was turning 16 next week, and Rick had spared no expense planning her sweet 16 party. The backyard was being transformed into something from a fairy tale, complete with string lights, a DJ, and catering from the finest restaurant in town. Rick wanted his daughter to have everything he never had growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, where he'd learned that respect was earned through strength, not given freely. "Dad, you really didn't have to do all this," Sarah said, watching the party planners work from the kitchen window. She had Rick's sharp green eyes and his stubborn streak, but Delia's graceful features. "Nothing's too good for my princess," Rick replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Besides, you only turned 16 once." Delia walked into the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. "I have to run some errands," she said, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "The caterer needs final numbers, and I promised I'd pick up the cake myself." Rick nodded, but something nagged at him. Delia had been taking more phone calls lately, always stepping away when he entered the room. She'd been distracted during conversations, and twice he'd caught her quickly closing her laptop when he walked into their home office. In his line of work, Rick had learned to trust his instincts. They'd kept him alive in Afghanistan and had made him successful in business. Right now, those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. After Delia left, Rick made a decision that would change everything. He walked to their home office and opened Delia's laptop. It wasn't password protected. She'd always said she had nothing to hide from him. The browser history told a different story. Hotel reservations. Deleted text messages that he recovered with software he kept for work. Photos that made his blood run cold. And worst of all, conversations with Malcolm Gentry, the police chief of Pine Ridge. Malcolm Gentry was everything Rick despised. A man who'd inherited his position through connections rather than merit, who used his badge to intimidate rather than protect. Rick had crossed paths with Malcolm several times over the years, particularly when Rick's security work conflicted with Malcolm's desire to control everything in his jurisdiction. The messages between Delia and Malcolm went back 8 months. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning Rick's downfall. Malcolm had been feeding Delia information about Rick's business, looking for ways to undermine him. They discussed framing him for misconduct, using Malcolm's police connections to destroy Rick's reputation and business. But what made Rick's hands shake with rage was the final message thread. They were planning to use Sarah's party as an opportunity to humiliate Rick publicly. Malcolm's son Trevor, a spoiled 18-year-old with a history of trouble that his father had covered up, was supposed to make a move on Sarah. If Rick reacted protectively, Malcolm would arrest him for assault, claiming he was unstable and violent. They were using his daughter as bait. Rick closed the laptop and walked to his safe. Inside, along with important documents and cash, was a burner phone he kept for emergencies. He'd hoped never to use the contacts stored in it. Men from his past who operated in the shadows, who owed him favors from their time, serving together in places that didn't officially exist. But Delia and Malcolm had made a critical error. They'd threatened Sarah. Rick Walsh had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, built a business from nothing, and earned the respect of some very dangerous people. He'd been willing to overlook many things in his marriage, to forgive small betrayals and disappointed expectations. But he'd never forgive anyone who put his daughter in danger. As he scrolled through the contacts on the burner phone, Rick began to smile. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd just caught sight of prey. The party was in 3 days. Delia and Malcolm thought they were setting a trap for him. They had no idea they were walking into one instead. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. Rick spent the next 2 days in careful preparation, his military training kicking in as he planned his operation. During the day, he maintained his normal routine, going to work, discussing party details with Delia, acting like the devoted husband and father he'd always been. But at night, after his family was asleep, he made calls and set pieces in motion. His first call was to Gerald Oliver, a former teammate who now ran a private investigation firm specializing in sensitive matters. Gerald owed Rick his life from a mission in Kandahar, and that debt had never been called in. Rick Walsh. Gerald's voice was cautious when he answered the secure line. Been a long time. I need a favor, Jerry. The kind we don't talk about afterward. How deep? Deep enough that it changes everything. You still have contacts in federal agencies? Gerald's pause told Rick everything. What kind of timeline? 72 hours to get everything in place. Execution begins at my daughter's party this Saturday. Jesus, Rick. What did they do? They threatened Sarah. Another pause. In their world, that was all the explanation needed. Send me what you have. I'll make some calls. Rick's second call was to Chuck Osborne, who'd left the military to work in private military contracting. Chuck specialized in making problems disappear, and he operated with a network of men who asked few questions and left no traces. I need a team for surveillance and extraction, Rick told him, and I needed to look completely legal. Domestic? Police chief who thinks his badge makes him untouchable. Chuck laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Those are my favorite kind. How messy, clean, and permanent. I want him to lose everything he cares about, but I want him alive to see it happen. While Rick coordinated with his old team, he also began documenting everything he discovered about Delia and Malcolm's affair. But he didn't plan to use it in divorce court. Rick had something much more devastating in mind. On Friday evening, the night before Sarah's party, Rick sat in his study reviewing the final details. Gerald had worked his federal contacts, and by Monday morning, Malcolm Gentry would be under investigation for corruption charges that would end his career and likely put him in prison. The evidence was being planted carefully. Financial records, communications with known criminals, and falsified reports that would surface during a routine audit. Chuck's team was already in position around the house, ready to document everything that happened at the party. They had equipment that could detect drugs and drinks, record conversations from 100 yards away, and track movements through sophisticated surveillance technology. But Rick's masterstroke was simpler and more personal. He'd learned that Malcolm's weakness wasn't power or money. It was his son, Trevor. The boy was everything to Malcolm, his pride and legacy. And Trevor had a secret that even his father didn't know, a gambling addiction that had put him in debt to some very dangerous people. Rick had quietly bought that debt. Sarah knocked on the study door, interrupting his thoughts. Dad, can I come in? Of course, Princess. Rick closed the files and smiled at his daughter. I wanted to thank you again for the party tomorrow. I know Mom's been stressed about it, but I can tell you've put a lot of work into making it special. Rick studied his daughter's face. Sarah was smart, too smart not to sense the tension in the house. But she was also innocent, trusting in a way that Rick envied and was determined to protect. Sarah, I want you to remember something tomorrow. If anything happens, anything at all that makes you uncomfortable, you come to me immediately. Don't worry about being polite or causing a scene. Just find me. Sarah frowned. Dad, what do you think is going to happen? Probably nothing. But I didn't keep you safe for 16 years by taking chances. That night, Delia came to bed later than usual, claiming she'd been on the phone with the caterer about last-minute changes. Rick pretended to sleep as she settled beside him, but he was planning. Tomorrow would be the last night they shared a bed. By Sunday, Delia would discover that her world had collapsed completely, and Malcolm Gentry would learn that there were consequences for threatening Rick Walsh's family. As Rick finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of his daughter's smile. Sarah trusted him to protect her, to be the father she deserved. Tomorrow, he would prove that trust was well placed, even if it meant becoming someone she might not recognize. Chapter 3. The Sweet 16 Trap. Saturday arrived with perfect weather. as if the universe was setting the stage for Rick's carefully orchestrated plan. The backyard had been transformed into an elegant party venue, with white tents, flowers, and a dance floor that gleamed under string lights. Sarah looked radiant in her blue dress, Rick's favorite color, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel proud of the normal father-daughter moment. But Rick was never off duty. Chuck's surveillance team was positioned around the property, invisible but recording everything. Gerald's federal contacts were standing by to move on Monday morning, and Rick himself wore a small recording device, waiting for his wife and her lover to hang themselves with their own words. The guests began arriving at 6 p.m. Sarah's friends from school, neighbors, family friends, and Malcolm Gentry with his son Trevor. Rick watched them enter his home with cold calculation. Malcolm wore his dress uniform, playing the part of the respected police chief. Trevor looked nervous, which confirmed Rick's suspicions about what the boy was planning. "Rick," Malcolm's voice boomed across the backyard as he approached with 2 drinks. "Hell of a party you've put together. Sarah's a lucky girl. She deserves the best," Rick replied, accepting the drink but not drinking from it. One of Chuck's team would test it later for substances. "Kids grow up so fast these days," Malcolm continued, his eyes scanning the party. "Before you know it, they're making their own decisions, getting into trouble. Good thing Sarah's got a smart head on her shoulders," Rick said, "and parents who pay attention." Malcolm's smile faltered slightly. "Of course. Though sometimes kids surprise you. Sometimes they do things you never expected." Across the yard, Rick spotted Trevor approaching Sarah and her friends. The boy was 18, too old to be at a 16-year-old's party, but Rick had specifically included him on the guest list. He needed Trevor to make his move for the plan to work. Delia appeared at Rick's side, wearing a red dress that was too revealing for a family party. "Malcolm, so glad you could make it. I hope Trevor enjoys himself." "I'm sure he will," Malcolm replied, his hand briefly touching Delia's lower back, a gesture that confirmed everything Rick had suspected. Rick excused himself and moved through the party, playing the perfect host while monitoring the situation. His team was in position. Sarah was surrounded by friends, safe for the moment, and Trevor was getting bolder, bringing Sarah drinks and trying to separate her from the group. At 9 p.m., it happened. Rick was talking to neighbors when Sarah's friend Angie Stewart ran up to him, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Walsh, something's wrong with Sarah." She was just talking normally, and then she started swaying and acting confused. Rick's blood turned to ice. He followed Angie to where Sarah was sitting on a chair, looking disoriented and frightened. Trevor was standing nearby with an empty glass in his hand, trying to look concerned but failing to hide his guilt. "Sarah, baby, what's wrong?" Rick knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle but his eyes scanning for threats. "I feel dizzy, Dad. Everything's spinning." Sarah's words were slurred, her pupils dilated. Rick stood and faced Trevor, his voice deadly calm. "What did you give her?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Trevor stammered, but his guilty expression told the whole story. "Dad," Malcolm had approached, putting on his concerned police chief act. "What's going on here?" "Your son drugged my daughter." Rick's voice carried across the suddenly quiet party. "That's a serious accusation," Malcolm said, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "Maybe you should calm down before you say something you'll regret." But Rick was already moving. He swept Sarah into his arms and announced to the party, "The party's over. Everyone needs to leave now." As guests began filing out, Rick locked eyes with Delia. She was standing near Malcolm, and her expression wasn't shock or concern. It was disappointment that their plan had failed. "I'm taking Sarah to the hospital," Rick announced. "Delia, you're coming with me." "I think I should stay and help clean up," Delia began. "You're coming with me," Rick repeated, his tone brooking no argument. At the hospital, the blood test confirmed what Rick already knew. Sarah had been given GHB, a date rape drug. The amount was significant enough to be dangerous, but Rick had acted quickly enough to prevent any lasting harm. As Sarah slept off the drug's effects, Rick made his calls. First to his lawyer, then to Gerald, and finally to Chuck. "Phase 2 begins now," he told Chuck. "I want Malcolm and Trevor in custody by morning on federal charges. And I want Delia to find out exactly what kind of man she's been sleeping with. By Monday morning, Rick had filed for divorce and sole custody of Sarah. The federal investigation into Malcolm Gentry began with a raid on his home and office, and Trevor Gentry was arrested for attempted sexual assault and drug trafficking, charges that would stick thanks to the evidence Rick's team had gathered. But Rick's revenge was just beginning. Delia would learn that betraying Rick Walsh came with a price that would take years to pay, and Malcolm Gentry would discover that his badge meant nothing when he was facing men who operated by different rules entirely. Rick had spent 15 years being a loving husband and devoted father. Now it was time to be what his enemies had forced him to become, a man with nothing left to lose and the skills to make them pay for it. Chapter 4. The Unraveling. The Monday morning raids on Malcolm Gentry's properties made the front page of every local newspaper. Rick watched the news coverage from his lawyer's office, Sarah beside him as they discussed custody arrangements. His daughter was still pale from the weekend's ordeal, but the fire in her eyes reminded Rick why he was doing this. "Dad, will Trevor go to prison?" Sarah asked quietly. "Yes, Princess, and so will his father." Rick's lawyer, Adam Buchanan, had been handling the Walsh family's legal affairs for years, but he'd never seen Rick like this, focused with an intensity that was almost frightening. "The divorce papers are ready," Adam said, sliding documents across his desk. "Given the circumstances, the attempted drugging, the adultery evidence, and Delia's clear involvement in planning harm to Sarah, we're asking for everything. Full custody, the house, the business assets, alimony termination. What about Delia's defense?" Adam smiled grimly. "She's going to have bigger problems than divorce court. The FBI investigation into Malcolm has expanded to include all his close associates. Your wife's communications with him are now part of a federal case." Rick had known this would happen. Gerald's contacts had done their work perfectly. The investigation into Malcolm looked completely legitimate, triggered by an anonymous tip about corruption in the Pine Ridge Police Department. But Rick had made sure the evidence trail would lead investigators directly to Delia's involvement. "Sir," Adam continued, "I have to ask, are you planning to leave town with Sarah? We're taking a vacation while this sorts itself out. Somewhere safe." That afternoon, Rick and Sarah packed quickly while Delia was at her lawyer's office, trying to understand how her world had collapsed so suddenly. Rick had already closed their joint bank accounts and transferred all assets to accounts in his name only. Their shared credit cards were canceled. The house would be sold as part of the divorce settlement. By evening, Rick and Sarah were on a private plane to a location that only Chuck's team knew. They would be safe there while Rick's larger plan unfolded. The destination was a private ranch in Montana, owned by one of Rick's military contacts. It was isolated, secure, and completely off the grid. Sarah would be tutored by a former teacher who specialized in homeschooling children of military families. She would be safe, happy, and far away from the destruction Rick was about to unleash. "Dad, what happens next?" Sarah asked as they settled into the ranch house. "You focus on school and healing," Rick said. "I focus on making sure no one ever threatens you again." Back in Pine Ridge, Delia was discovering the full extent of her situation. The FBI had frozen her bank accounts as part of their investigation. Her lawyer informed her that the evidence against her was overwhelming, not just for the affair, but for conspiracy charges related to Malcolm's corruption. Malcolm himself was in federal custody, facing charges that would put him away for decades. The evidence against him was ironclad. Financial records showing payoffs from criminal organizations, falsified police reports, and witness testimony from criminals he protected in exchange for money. But Trevor's situation was the most devastating blow to Malcolm. The boy had been arrested not just for the attack on Sarah, but for a string of similar assaults that Rick's investigation had uncovered. Girls who had been too afraid to report the police chief's son, victims who now found the courage to speak when they saw him in custody. Rick monitored all of this from Montana, using secure communication channels to coordinate with his team. But he wasn't satisfied with legal justice. Malcolm and Delia had threatened Sarah, and legal consequences weren't enough. It was time for the personal touch. On Thursday night, Chuck's team executed a precision operation that would never be traced back to Rick. Malcolm, awaiting trial in federal custody, received a visit from fellow inmates who had been paid to deliver a message. They explained to him, in terms he couldn't misunderstand, that his son's victims had friends on the outside, friends who didn't believe in due process. By Friday morning, Malcolm had requested protective custody, terrified for his life. Delia received her own message that same day. She returned to the house she'd shared with Rick to find it empty, not just of furniture, but of every trace that Rick and Sarah had ever lived there. Their photos were gone. Sarah's room was stripped bare. Even Rick's home office had been cleared out. But in the master bedroom, Delia found a single envelope on the bare mattress. Inside was a photo from her Sweet 16 party, Sarah looking confused and frightened, Trevor standing nearby with guilt written on his face. On the back, Rick had written a single sentence: "You chose your side. Now live with the consequences." Also in the envelope was a legal document transferring ownership of the house to Sarah Walsh, effective on her 18th birthday. Until then, it would remain empty, a monument to Delia's betrayal. Delia tried calling Rick, but his number was disconnected. She tried reaching out through mutual friends, but discovered that everyone in their social circle had been told about her affair and her role in the attack on Sarah. She was radioactive, a pariah in the community she tried to manipulate. By the weekend, Delia was living in a studio apartment across town, working as a waitress because no other job would hire someone under federal investigation. Malcolm was in solitary confinement, having received death threats from multiple sources. Trevor was in juvenile detention, facing charges that would put him in adult prison once he turned 18. But Rick wasn't finished. From Montana, he made one final call to Gerald. Phase 3 begins now. I want them to understand that this isn't just about punishment. It's about erasure. By the time I'm done, it will be like they never existed. Rick Walsh had always been a man who finished what he started. And he was just getting started. Chapter 5. The Hunt. 3 months had passed since Rick and Sarah disappeared from Pine Ridge. Sarah was thriving at the Montana ranch, her trauma healing under the care of Dr. Lucille Townsend, a therapist who specialized in working with children of military families. The fresh air, open spaces, and distance from the toxic situation back home had restored her smile and confidence. Rick, however, was busier than ever. From his secure base of operations, he orchestrated a campaign of systematic destruction that went far beyond anything the legal system could deliver. Malcolm Gentry and Delia were about to learn that federal prison was the least of their worries. The first phase targeted their remaining connections and support systems. Rick had spent weeks identifying everyone who had enabled Malcolm's corruption or who had turned a blind eye to his crimes. Using a combination of his security firm's resources and his military contacts, Rick began feeding information to journalists, federal investigators, and rival criminals. Malcolm's entire network collapsed within weeks. Police officers who had taken bribes found themselves under investigation. Judges who had fixed cases discovered their bank accounts frozen. Criminal organizations that had paid Malcolm for protection suddenly found their operations exposed and their leadership arrested. But Rick's masterstroke was more personal. He had discovered that Malcolm's ex-wife, Jody Warner, had been paying child support for Trevor despite having no legal obligation to do so. She'd been doing it out of love for the boy she'd helped raise, even though Malcolm had cheated on her and destroyed their marriage. Rick arranged to meet Jody at a coffee shop in Denver, far from Pine Ridge and prying eyes. "Mrs. Warner, my name is Rick Walsh. I believe we have a mutual interest in seeing justice done." Jody was a woman in her 40s, elegant despite the stress lines around her eyes. "You're Sarah's father. I heard about what Trevor did to your daughter. I'm so sorry. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because you've been supporting Malcolm financially for years, and I think you deserve to know the truth about what your money has been funding." Rick slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, financial records, and witness statements that painted a picture of Malcolm's criminal empire. But more devastating were the photos of Trevor's previous victims, girls the same age as Sarah, all of whom had been silenced by Malcolm's influence. "My God," Jody whispered, her hands shaking. "I had no idea. Your support payments didn't just help Trevor. They helped Malcolm cover up these crimes." Every dollar you sent allowed him to pay off witnesses, intimidate victims, and protect his son from consequences. Jody closed the folder, her face pale. "What do you want from me? I want you to testify, not just about the money, but about Malcolm's character, about how he manipulated you, how he used your love for Trevor to fund his corruption. The prosecutors need someone who can speak to his pattern of manipulation and abuse. If I testify, I'll lose Trevor forever. He'll never forgive me." Rick leaned forward, his voice gentle but implacable. "Mrs. Warner, Trevor tried to rape my 16-year-old daughter. He drugged her at her own birthday party. He's not the boy you remember. He's become his father's son. And if you don't help stop this pattern, there will be more victims." That afternoon, Jody Warner contacted the federal prosecutors and agreed to testify against Malcolm. Her testimony would be devastating, not because of what she revealed about the money, but because of what she revealed about Malcolm's character. A man who would manipulate his ex-wife's love for his son in order to fund his criminal activities. Meanwhile, Delia was facing her own special form of hell. Rick had systematically destroyed every relationship she'd built over the years. Her friends received anonymous packages containing evidence of her affair and her role in planning the attack on Sarah. Her family was shown recordings of phone conversations where she'd laughed about her husband's gullibility and planned his downfall. But Rick's cruelest stroke was targeting Delia's sister, Nora Wright, who had always looked up to Delia as the successful one in the family. Nora had been planning to ask Delia for help with her son's college tuition, not knowing that Delia had lost access to all family money. Rick arranged for Nora to receive a full scholarship for her son, anonymously funded through one of his shell companies. Along with the scholarship notification came a letter explaining that the donor had specifically chosen to help her because they'd heard about her sister's betrayal and wanted to ensure that Nora's family didn't suffer for Delia's choices. The message was clear: Rick could help or hurt anyone in Delia's orbit. He was watching, and he had the power to control their lives. By the 4th month, Delia was completely isolated. Her mother refused to take her calls. Her sister had cut off all contact. Her former friends crossed the street to avoid her. She was working double shifts at a diner, barely making rent on her studio apartment, and facing federal charges that would likely result in prison time. Malcolm's situation was even worse. The death threats had escalated to actual attempts on his life. He'd been stabbed twice in federal custody, once by an inmate whose daughter had been one of Trevor's victims, and once by a criminal Malcolm had betrayed to save himself. He was now in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, afraid to eat the food or drink the water in case someone had poisoned it. Trevor was in juvenile detention, but Rick had made sure his crimes were well known among the other inmates. The boy who had once thought himself untouchable was now afraid to sleep at night. From Montana, Rick watched it all unfold with cold satisfaction. But he wasn't done yet. The final phase of his plan would ensure that none of them ever forgot the consequences of threatening his family. And it would send a message to anyone else who might consider crossing Rick Walsh in the future. Chapter 6: The Tightening Noose. By the 6-month mark, Rick's campaign of destruction had achieved results beyond even his expectations. The federal investigation had expanded to encompass the entire Pine Ridge city government, with multiple arrests and indictments flowing from the evidence Rick had carefully orchestrated them to find. The town that had once been Malcolm Gentry's kingdom was now a cautionary tale of corruption and abuse of power. But Rick wasn't satisfied with institutional justice. He wanted personal revenge. From his Montana base, Rick initiated the final phase of his plan. Using contact from his military days and his private security business, he began a campaign of psychological warfare that would break his enemies completely. Malcolm had been transferred to a federal facility in Colorado after the second attempt on his life. He was in protective custody, but Rick's reach extended even there. Through a carefully constructed network of prison guards, inmates, and staff who owed favors to Rick's associates, Malcolm began receiving gifts. The first was a photo of Sarah at the Montana ranch, healthy and happy, riding horses and laughing with her tutors. On the back, Rick had written, "This is what you try to destroy. She's safe from you now." The second gift was more pointed. A photo of Trevor in juvenile detention, surrounded by inmates who clearly wanted to hurt him. The message on the back read, "Your son is learning what it feels like to be helpless." But the cruelest gift was a letter from Malcolm's own father, a man who had died when Malcolm was 12. Rick had somehow obtained personal letters the old man had written to Malcolm as a child, letters full of pride and hope for his son's future. The final letter in the package was new, written in the same handwriting. "I'm ashamed of what you became. You dishonored everything I taught you." Malcolm's lawyer later reported that his client had suffered a complete psychological breakdown after receiving these items. He was now on suicide watch, heavily medicated, and had requested to change his plea to guilty on all charges. Delia's torment was more subtle but equally effective. Rick had purchased the diner where she worked, though she didn't know it. Her new owner began implementing policies clearly designed to make her life miserable. Mandatory overtime with no extra pay, impossible performance standards, and a schedule that changed daily without notice. But the real psychological pressure came from the reminders of what she'd lost. Every day, Delia received small gifts that reminded her of her former life. A photo of the house she used to live in, now empty and abandoned. A brochure from Sarah's new private school in Montana, highlighting the education and opportunities Delia would never be part of. Flowers on the anniversary of her wedding to Rick, with a card that read, "Until death do us part. Your loving husband." The final blow came when Delia received a package containing her old jewelry, pieces Rick had given her for birthdays and anniversaries over the years. Each piece was accompanied by a note detailing when and why Rick had bought it for her, along with his feelings at the time. The last note read, "I loved you enough to give you everything. You loved me so little that you threw it all away." But Rick's most devastating psychological weapon was patience. While Malcolm raged in his cell and Delia struggled to survive, Rick simply waited. He knew that true revenge wasn't a single moment of justice. It was the slow, grinding realization that their choices had consequences that would follow them forever. Meanwhile, Sarah was flourishing in Montana. She'd grown taller, her confidence restored by the safety Rick had provided. She was excelling in her studies, had made friends among the other children at the ranch, and had even begun talking about college and her future career. "Dad, when do you think we can go home?" she asked one evening as they watched the sunset from the ranch's porch. "This is our home now, Princess. Pine Ridge was just a place we used to live. But what about your business? Your friends?" Rick smiled, but it was the cold expression that his enemies had learned to fear. "I sold the business 6 months ago. As for friends, Real friends understand that family comes first." What Rick didn't tell Sarah was that he'd liquidated almost everything from their old life. The security firm had been sold to one of his competitors. The house in Pine Ridge remained empty, legally transferred to Sarah, but practically abandoned. Their old life had been erased as completely as Rick could manage. But Rick had kept one connection to Pine Ridge, a network of informants who reported on Malcolm, Delia, and Trevor's situations. He wanted to know about every court date, every plea hearing, every moment of their suffering. Not because he took pleasure in their pain, but because he needed to ensure they never forgot why they were being punished. Justice, Rick had learned, wasn't just about consequences. It was about understanding. Malcolm and Delia needed to understand that their choices had destroyed not just their own lives, but had threatened the most precious thing in Rick's world, his daughter's safety and innocence. And that was a crime Rick Walsh would never forgive. As the first year of their exile drew to a close, Rick began planning the final act of his revenge. It would be swift, final, and would ensure that his enemies understood the true cost of betraying him. He'd been patient long enough. Now it was time to end this permanently. Chapter 7. The Final Judgment. 1 year after the Sweet 16 party that had changed everything, Rick Walsh returned to Pine Ridge for the first time. Sarah remained safely in Montana. She didn't need to see what came next. Rick checked into a hotel under an assumed name and began preparing for the final phase of his revenge. The town had changed dramatically in his absence. The corruption investigation had destroyed the city government, with multiple officials resigning or being arrested. The police department had been placed under federal oversight. Property values had plummeted as the scandal drove away businesses and families. Pine Ridge was a broken community, and Rick had been the architect of its destruction. Malcolm Gentry's trial was scheduled to begin in 3 days. He would be representing himself, having exhausted his legal funds and driven away multiple attorneys with his erratic behavior. Trevor was now 18 and facing adult charges in a separate trial. Delia's plea hearing was set for the following week. Rick's plan required precise timing and the cooperation of several people who had reasons to want justice or revenge against his enemies. His first stop was the federal courthouse, where he met with prosecutor Judith Lindsay. She was a career federal attorney with a reputation for being thorough and relentless. "Mr. Walsh, I appreciate you coming forward with this information, but I have to ask, where has this evidence been for the past year?" Rick slid a sealed envelope across her desk. "I've been protecting my daughter and building an airtight case. Everything in that envelope is authentic and legally obtained. It will guarantee convictions for all 3 defendants." Inside the envelope were audio recordings of conversations between Malcolm and Delia, planning not just the attack on Sarah, but discussing how to frame Rick for domestic violence if he discovered their affair. There were financial records showing how Malcolm had used police resources to investigate Rick's business for personal reasons. And there were testimonies from victims who had finally agreed to come forward. "This is comprehensive," Judith admitted. "But some of this evidence, how did you obtain it?" "I'm in the private security business, counselor. Everything was obtained through legal surveillance methods, and I'm prepared to testify to that under oath." Rick's second meeting was with Everett Greenwood, a journalist who had been investigating police corruption for years. Rick provided him with information that would ensure the story received national attention, turning Malcolm's trial into a symbol of systemic abuse of power. But Rick's most important meeting was with Roberta Kerr, the mother of one of Trevor's previous victims. Her daughter Angie had been attacked 2 years earlier, but had been too afraid to report it because of Malcolm's reputation. "Mrs. Kerr, I know this is difficult, but your daughter's testimony could be the key to ensuring Trevor never hurts anyone again." Roberta was a woman in her 40s, worn down by years of watching her daughter struggle with trauma that had never been acknowledged or addressed. "Will it really make a difference? Or will they find a way to protect him like they always have?" "Trevor's father is powerless now. His network is destroyed. Your daughter will be believed, and she'll have justice. What about you? What do you get out of this?" Rick's expression hardened. "I get to ensure that no other father has to watch his daughter suffer because of these people." The trial began on a Monday morning with national media attention. Malcolm Gentry, representing himself, was a shadow of the man who had once terrorized Pine Ridge. He was thin, nervous, and clearly unstable. His opening statement was rambling and defensive, making wild accusations about conspiracies and frame-ups that only made him sound more guilty. The prosecution's case was devastating. Witness after witness testified about Malcolm's corruption, his abuse of power, and his systematic intimidation of victims. The evidence Rick had provided tied it all together into a narrative of a man who had turned his position of trust into a criminal enterprise. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah Walsh took the stand. Rick had debated whether to allow this, but Sarah had insisted. She was 17 now, poised and strong, and she wanted to face the man who had tried to destroy her life. "Trevor Gentry drugged me in my own birthday party," she testified, her voice clear and steady. "He did it with his father's knowledge and approval, as part of a plan to hurt my family. They used me as a weapon against my father, and they didn't care what happened to me in the process." Malcolm tried to cross-examine Sarah, but his questions were incoherent and aggressive. The judge warned him twice about his behavior, and the jury clearly saw him as a man trying to intimidate a teenage victim. When Sarah finished her testimony, she looked directly at Malcolm for the first time. "You tried to break my family," she said quietly, "but all you did was show us how strong we are." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Malcolm was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Trevor received 15 years for multiple counts of sexual assault. Delia pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received 10 years. But Rick's revenge didn't end with the sentencing. On the day Malcolm was transferred to federal prison, he received one final gift from Rick, a photo of Sarah at her high school graduation ceremony in Montana. She was valedictorian, accepting a full scholarship to Harvard. On the back, Rick had written his final message. "This is what you tried to destroy. She became everything you tried to prevent her from becoming. You lost." Delia's final gift was different. Divorce papers showing that their marriage had been annulled rather than divorced. In the eyes of the law, their 15-year marriage had never existed. Rick had paid significant legal fees to make this happen, but the message was worth it. Delia had forfeited any claim to having been part of his family. As Rick prepared to return to Montana, he made one last stop at the house where his family had once lived. It remained empty, exactly as he'd left it, but there was a for sale sign in the yard. The real estate agent was waiting for him. "Mr. Walsh, are you sure about this? The market is terrible right now, and you'll lose money on the sale." "I don't care about the money. Just make sure the buyer knows the house's history. I want everyone to remember what happened here." Rick Walsh had spent 2 years systematically destroying everyone who had threatened his daughter. He'd used legal means when possible, but hadn't hesitated to employ methods that existed in the shadows between legal and illegal. He'd shown no mercy, offered no forgiveness, and left no loose ends. His enemies were broken, imprisoned, and forgotten. His daughter was safe, successful, and ready to build her own life. And Rick himself had learned something important about the kind of man he truly was. He was the kind of man who finished what he started, no matter what it cost. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. 2 years had passed since the trials, and Rick Walsh's life had found a new equilibrium. Sarah had graduated as valedictorian from her Montana high school and was thriving at Harvard, studying criminal justice with a focus on victim advocacy. She turned her trauma into purpose, and Rick couldn't have been prouder. But the past wasn't finished with Rick Walsh. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Rick was reviewing security proposals for a new client. Chuck Osborne's voice was tense when Rick answered the secure line. "We have a problem, Rick. Malcolm Gentry escaped federal custody during a medical transport yesterday." Rick's blood turned cold. "Ow! Inside help. Someone on the transport team was paid off. Malcolm's been planning this for months, maybe longer. He's not trying to flee the country. He's coming for you." Rick had always known this moment might come. Malcolm Gentry was a man who had lost everything because of Rick's actions. Prison had given him time to plan, to seethe, and to blame Rick for every aspect of his downfall. Men like Malcolm didn't accept responsibility for their actions. They found scapegoats. What about Trevor? Delia? Trevor's still locked up, but someone broke Delia out of the minimum security facility where she was serving her sentence. This is coordinated, Rick. They've had help. Within hours, Rick had activated every security protocol he'd established over the past 2 years. Sarah was pulled from her classes at Harvard and moved to a safe house under the protection of former Special Forces operatives. The Montana ranch was secured with additional personnel, and Rick himself became a ghost, moving between safe houses while his network tracked Malcolm's movements. But Malcolm proved to be more resourceful than Rick had anticipated. The escape had been funded by criminal organizations that Malcolm had worked with during his time as police chief. People who saw Rick's systematic destruction of Malcolm's network as a threat to their own operations. The first attack came at Rick's former office in Pine Ridge. The building had been sold, but Malcolm apparently believed Rick still maintained operations there. The current occupants, a small accounting firm, barely escaped when Malcolm and 2 accomplices firebombed the building. The second attack was more personal. Malcolm had somehow tracked down Dr. Lucille Townsend, Sarah's therapist from the Montana ranch. He kidnapped her and sent Rick a video showing her tied to a chair in an abandoned warehouse. Rick Walsh. Malcolm's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and filled with rage. "You destroyed my life. You turned my son against me. You took everything I worked for and burned it to the ground. Now I'm going to do the same to you." In the video, Malcolm held a gun to Dr. Townsend's head. "You have 24 hours to turn yourself in. Come alone to the Pine Ridge Courthouse at midnight tomorrow, or I start killing everyone you've ever cared about." Rick studied the video with cold calculation. Malcolm looked like a man who had nothing left to lose, exactly the kind of enemy Rick had hoped never to face. But Rick had been preparing for this possibility for years. He made 2 phone calls. The first was to Gerald Oliver, his intelligence contact. "I need a full tactical team and surveillance on every building in Pine Ridge. Shoot to kill authorization on Malcolm Gentry and any associates." The second call was to Sarah at her safe house. "Princess, I need you to listen carefully. Some bad people from our past are trying to hurt us, but I'm going to stop them. I need you to stay exactly where you are until I call you." "Dad, are you in danger?" "I've been in danger before. I know how to handle it." What Rick didn't tell Sarah was that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment he'd chosen to destroy Malcolm completely rather than simply exposing his crimes. Rick had made the calculation that showing mercy to someone who threatened Sarah would be seen as weakness, inviting future attacks. But total destruction created enemies who had nothing left to lose. Now Rick would discover whether his tactical skills were still sharp enough to handle a desperate enemy on familiar ground. The Pine Ridge Courthouse at midnight was a trap, obviously, but it was also an opportunity. Malcolm thought he was luring Rick into a kill zone, but Rick had been studying that building for months, planning for exactly this scenario. Gerald's team was already in position around the courthouse when Rick arrived. Thermal imaging showed 3 heat signatures inside: Malcolm, Delia, and one other person Rick didn't recognize. Dr. Townsend was being held in the old jury room on the 2nd floor. Rick entered through a service entrance he'd mapped during his security work years earlier. His movements were silent, precise, informed by decades of military and private security experience. He was armed but hoped to avoid killing Malcolm, not out of mercy, but because dead men couldn't suffer. He found Delia first, stationed as a lookout on the 1st floor stairwell. She was armed with a pistol, but clearly untrained in its use. When Rick appeared behind her, she tried to turn and fire, but only managed to shoot wildly into the ceiling before Rick disarmed her. "Hello, Delia," Rick said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 2 years of planning. "Did you miss me?" "Rick, please. Malcolm's lost his mind. He forced me to help him. I didn't want any part of this. You helped him plan to rape our daughter. You laughed about it. You forfeited any right to my mercy that night." Rick zip-tied Delia's hands behind her back and moved toward the 2nd floor. Malcolm would be expecting him now, which meant the real confrontation was about to begin. He found Malcolm in the main courtroom, holding Dr. Townsend at gunpoint while watching the entrances. The man Rick remembered as an arrogant, corrupt police chief was gone, replaced by something that looked like a cornered animal. "I wondered when you'd show up," Malcolm called out when he spotted Rick. "Did you bring your army with you?" "I don't need an army to handle one broken-down ex-cop," Rick replied, stepping into the courtroom with his hands visible but ready to move. "Broken down? You destroyed everything I built. My career, my reputation, my son's future, all gone because you couldn't accept that your perfect little family wasn't so perfect. My family was perfect until you threatened it." Malcolm laughed, a sound devoid of sanity. "Your wife came to me, Rick. She was tired of being married to a cold, controlling bastard who treated her like property. She wanted a real man. She wanted a corrupt cop who would help her destroy her husband. That says more about her than it does about me." The conversation was a distraction, Rick realized. Malcolm was waiting for something, backup, perhaps, or trying to draw Rick into a position where he'd have a clear shot. But Rick had spent too many years in hostile territory to be caught by amateur tactics. The shot came from behind Rick, fired by the 3rd person Gerald's thermal imaging had detected. But Rick had been expecting it, dropping and rolling as the bullet passed through the space where his head had been. His return fire was precise and final. The shooter dropped without getting a second chance. Malcolm used the distraction to put his gun to Dr. Townsend's head. "Back off, Rick, or she dies." But Rick was no longer the man Malcolm remembered. 2 years of planning this confrontation, of preparing for every possible scenario, had turned him into something harder and more dangerous than the businessman Malcolm had tried to destroy. "Pull that trigger," Rick said calmly, "and you'll spend the rest of your very short life wishing you hadn't." The standoff lasted only seconds. Malcolm's nerve broke first. He'd been in prison too long, had lost too much, and was facing a man who clearly had nothing left to fear. When Malcolm hesitated, Rick moved. The disarming technique was one Rick had learned in Afghanistan and perfected in dozens of similar situations. Malcolm never had a chance to fire. Within seconds, he was on the ground, his weapon out of reach, and Rick's boot on his throat. "You made one mistake, Malcolm," Rick said, applying just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "You thought this was about revenge. It wasn't. It was about elimination." Gerald's team swept the courthouse, ensuring there were no other threats. Dr. Townsend was freed and taken to safety. Delia was arrested by federal marshals who had been standing by. And Malcolm Gentry learned that escaping from prison was the least of his problems. Rick made one final call to Sarah. "It's over, Princess. You're safe. We're all safe." But even as he said the words, Rick knew they weren't entirely true. As long as he was the kind of man who destroyed his enemies completely, there would always be the possibility of retaliation. It was the price of the choices he'd made, the life he'd chosen to live. Rick Walsh had won again, but victory always came with a cost. Chapter 9. The Price of Victory. 6 months after the courthouse confrontation, Rick Walsh sat in his new office in Denver, Colorado. He'd relocated his business there, far enough from Pine Ridge to avoid constant reminders of the past, but close enough to keep an eye on any remaining threats. Sarah had returned to Harvard for her sophomore year, stronger and more determined than ever. She'd chosen to major in criminal justice with a focus on victim advocacy, turning her trauma into a mission to help others. Malcolm Gentry was back in federal prison, this time in a maximum security facility with no possibility of escape. His sentence had been extended to life without parole after the escape attempt, kidnapping, and attempted murder charges. He would die behind bars, forgotten by everyone except the victims whose lives he destroyed. Delia was serving an additional 10 years for her role in the escape and kidnapping. She tried to claim coercion, but the evidence showed she'd been a willing participant in planning the attack on Rick. Her transformation from suburban housewife to desperate criminal was complete. Trevor had been killed in prison 3 months earlier, stabbed by an inmate whose sister had been one of his victims. Rick felt no satisfaction at the news. The boy's death was a waste, the inevitable result of Malcolm's failures as a father and a man. Rick's business was thriving. His reputation for absolute reliability and ruthless efficiency had made him one of the most sought-after security consultants in the region. His clients knew that Rick Walsh never left a job unfinished and never forgave a betrayal. That reputation was both his greatest asset and his heaviest burden. The price of his victory had been higher than Rick had anticipated. He'd gained everything he'd fought for: Sarah's safety, the destruction of his enemies, and a secure future for his family. But he'd lost something harder to define: the ability to trust, to relax, to believe that the people he cared about were truly safe. He'd become the kind of man who checked his car for bombs every morning, who varied his routes to work, who maintained safe houses in 3 different states. He'd won the war against Malcolm and Delia, but the victory had changed him into someone who was always fighting the next battle. Sarah understood this better than anyone. During her visits home, she would find her father reviewing security reports, analyzing potential threats, planning contingencies for dangers that might never materialize. He'd saved her from becoming a victim, but in the process, he'd become a prisoner of his own vigilance. "Dad," she said during her Christmas visit, "when are you going to let yourself be happy?" They were sitting in Rick's Denver apartment, a fortress-like space with state-of-the-art security systems and multiple escape routes. It was comfortable but cold, the home of a man who prioritized safety over warmth. "I'm happy, Princess. You're safe, you're successful, you're building the life you want. That's all I need. But what about your life? When was the last time you went on a date? When was the last time you had friends over for dinner? When was the last time you did anything that wasn't related to security or business?" Rick smiled, but it was the expression Sarah had learned to recognize as his deflection mechanism. "I have everything I need." "No, Dad, you don't. You have everything you think you need to keep us safe, but you don't have a life." It was a conversation they'd had multiple times, and it always ended the same way, with Rick changing the subject and Sarah feeling frustrated but understanding. She knew what her father had sacrificed to protect her, and she loved him for it. But she also knew that his sacrifices had cost him more than he was willing to admit. The truth was that Rick Walsh had become exactly what his enemies had forced him to become, a man defined by his capacity for destruction rather than creation. He'd been a loving husband and father once, but those aspects of his personality had been burned away in the fire of his revenge. He'd won every battle, but the war had changed him into someone who couldn't imagine peace. 3 years after the courthouse confrontation, Rick received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Lucille Townsend, the therapist Malcolm had kidnapped, came to his Denver office with a proposal. "Mr. Walsh, I've been working with families affected by violent crime for my entire career. I've seen how trauma can destroy people, but I've also seen how it can be transformed into something positive. Dr. Townsend, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not interested in therapy. I'm not here to offer you therapy. I'm here to offer you a partnership." She explained her vision, a foundation that would provide security services and victim advocacy for families threatened by criminals the legal system couldn't or wouldn't stop. It would combine Rick's tactical expertise with professional therapeutic support, helping victims become survivors and survivors become advocates. "You've spent the last 5 years perfecting the art of destruction," Dr. Townsend said. "What if you used those same skills for protection and healing?" Rick considered the proposal for weeks. It would mean stepping back from the pure security work that had defined his post-divorce life and moving into something more complex and emotionally demanding. But it would also mean finding a way to use his talents that didn't require him to become someone he barely recognized. Sarah was enthusiastic when Rick told her about the foundation. "Dad, this is perfect. You can help other families without having to destroy people. You can be the kind of person who builds things instead of tearing them down." "I'm not sure I remember how to be that person, princess." "Then learn. You taught me that we can choose who we become. Maybe it's time for you to make that choice for yourself." 6 months later, the Walsh Foundation for Victim Advocacy opened its doors in Denver. Rick served as Director of Security Services, using his network of military and law enforcement contacts to provide protection for families threatened by criminals. Dr. Townsend handled the therapeutic and legal advocacy aspects, helping victims navigate the complex world of law enforcement and courts. Their first case was a family whose teenage daughter had been stalked by a classmate with connections to organized crime. The local police were unable or unwilling to provide adequate protection, and the family was terrified. Rick's team provided security while Dr. Townsend worked with prosecutors to build a case that would put the stalker away permanently. It was satisfying work, Rick discovered. Using his skills to protect rather than destroy, to build safety rather than engineer revenge. He was still the same man who had systematically destroyed Malcolm Gentry's life, but now those capabilities served a different purpose. The foundation grew quickly, funded by Rick's successful security business and grant from organizations that recognized the need for their unique services. They helped dozens of families in their first year, and Rick found himself sleeping better than he had in years. Sarah graduated from Harvard with honors and was accepted to law school, planning to specialize in victim advocacy. She'd taken her trauma and turned it into a calling, exactly as Rick had hoped she would. On the 5th anniversary of her Sweet 16 party, Sarah called Rick from Cambridge. "Dad, I want you to know something. What happened to me was terrible, but what you did afterward, the way you protected me, the way you made sure I was safe, that changed my life in ways that had nothing to do with the trauma." "How so?" "You showed me that I was worth protecting, that I mattered enough for someone to risk everything to keep me safe. That gave me the strength to turn what happened into something positive." Rick felt something he hadn't experienced in years, pride that wasn't mixed with anger or fear. His daughter had become exactly the person he'd hoped she would be, not despite what had happened to her, but because of how they'd faced it together. "I love you, princess. I love you too, Dad, and I'm proud of who you've become." That night, Rick Walsh allowed himself to believe that maybe, finally, the war was over. He'd won everything that mattered: his daughter's safety, his enemy's defeat, and now, perhaps, the chance to build something better from the ashes of his old life. He'd learned that some betrayals could never be forgiven, some enemies could never be redeemed, and some fights had to be won at any cost. But he'd also learned that victory without purpose was just another form of destruction, and that the greatest revenge was living well despite what others had tried to take from you. Rick Walsh had been many things: a soldier, a businessman, a husband, a father, and a destroyer of enemies. Now, finally, he was choosing to be something new, a protector who built rather than burned, who saved rather than destroyed. It was, he thought, a much better way to win.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.